There is something about the first hour of your day that most people never notice. Before the world asks anything from you, your mind is already being shaped. And if you give those first moments to noise, notifications, urgency, and other people's priorities, you may be training yourself to live reactively without even realizing it. But here is what almost nobody tells you about waking up at 4 a.m. The real power has nothing to do with the clock. It is what that hour forces you to confront. For 90 days, you are going to meet yourself before the distractions arrive. And in that quiet, something begins to change. Not because 4 a.m. is magical, and not because success has a secret hour, but because repeated behavior can reshape the way you think, focus, and respond to your own life. And there is one specific shift that can make those 90 mornings far more powerful than simply becoming an early riser. I'll reveal that shift later in this video. For now, ask yourself one question. What would happen if, for the next 90 days, you stopped letting the world decide how your day begins? If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success. So I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Most people think waking up early is a discipline problem. They imagine the person who gets up at 4 a.m. as someone with extraordinary willpower, someone who simply decided to stop making excuses and become more productive. But that picture misses something important. Your morning is not just a schedule. It is a vote for the person you are becoming. Think about what usually happens when your alarm rings. You open your eyes, reach for your phone, check a message, glance at the news, look at social media, and before your feet even touch the floor, someone else has already entered your mind. You haven't made a decision yet, but your attention has already been claimed. That small moment seems harmless. It happens every day, yet repeated often enough, it becomes familiar. And what becomes familiar can begin to feel normal, even when it is keeping you exactly where you are. Napoleon Hill repeatedly emphasized the importance of definite purpose, focused thought, and persistent action. His philosophy was not built around waiting for circumstances to change. It was built around deliberately directing your mind and behavior toward a chosen outcome. That distinction matters, because waking up at 4 a.m. does not make you wealthy. It does not automatically make you disciplined, and it certainly does not guarantee success. What it can do is create a protected space in which you practice directing yourself instead of constantly reacting to everything around you. Imagine sitting at your kitchen table while the house is still quiet. No emails, no calls, no one asking anything from you. For once, there is nowhere to hide behind urgency. And that is where the uncomfortable part begins. When the noise disappears, you can hear the thoughts you've been avoiding. Maybe you've been telling yourself that you need more money when what you really need is a clearer direction. Maybe you've been waiting for motivation when what you actually lack is consistency. Maybe you've been blaming your circumstances because admitting that your daily choices have influence over your future feels much harder. The quiet does not create those truths. It simply makes them harder to ignore. And once you begin seeing your mornings this way, something changes in the meaning of those first few hours. You are no longer waking up early just to have more time. You are creating a place where your old patterns have less control over you. But there is a deeper reason this matters, because changing what you do in the morning is only the surface of what you are really trying to change. There is a reason your old patterns can feel stronger than your intentions. You can genuinely want a different life and still wake up tomorrow making the same choices you made yesterday. That does not necessarily mean you are weak. It means repetition has a way of becoming automatic. Think about driving a familiar route. You can arrive at your destination and barely remember the journey. Your hands move, your eyes scan the road, and countless decisions happen without requiring your full attention. Your mind does something similar with behavior. The thoughts you repeatedly entertain, the actions you repeatedly perform, and even the way you respond to ordinary problems can become increasingly familiar. That is why knowing what you should do is often much easier than actually doing it. And this is where the 4 a.m. routine becomes interesting. Not because waking up before sunrise possesses some special power, but because it gives you an unusual opportunity to interrupt the automatic sequence. You wake up. You resist the impulse to return to sleep. You get out of bed when nobody is watching. That moment may seem insignificant. It isn't. You have just made a decision before the world made one for you. Do that repeatedly, and you begin collecting evidence about yourself. You are no longer merely telling yourself, "I need more discipline." You are showing yourself that you can keep a commitment when there is no applause, no deadline, and no immediate reward. That distinction is easy to overlook. Your identity is influenced not only by what you believe about yourself, but also by what your repeated actions demonstrate to you. This is one reason lasting change rarely comes from a single burst of motivation. Motivation rises and falls. A practiced behavior can remain. Napoleon Hill placed enormous importance on persistence. In his philosophy, a definite purpose becomes meaningful when it is supported by sustained effort rather than temporary enthusiasm. Now imagine applying that principle to something extremely small. Tomorrow morning, the alarm rings. For a few seconds, your mind negotiates with you. Just 5 more minutes. You can start tomorrow. You need to sleep. And suddenly, the entire battle is taking place before the day has even begun. If you get up, you have done more than leave your bed. You have interrupted a familiar pattern. If you repeat that decision again and again, the morning itself begins to carry a different meaning. But there is another side to this that most people miss. You are not simply training yourself to wake up earlier. You are learning whether you can direct your attention when your mind wants to follow the easiest path. And that ability becomes far more valuable once you take it beyond the bedroom. Because eventually, the real question is no longer whether you can wake up at 4 a.m. It is whether you can sit in that quiet and decide what deserves your attention before the rest of the world decides for you. At first, the silence may feel uncomfortable. You sit there with your coffee, the room still dark, and realize how much of your day has always been filled before you ever had a chance to choose what mattered. That discomfort is useful, because most people don't realize how dependent they have become on stimulation. The phone gives them something to check. The inbox gives them something to answer. The news gives them something to react to. Even small problems can feel strangely comforting because they provide an immediate direction. Silence offers none of that. It asks you to choose. And choice is where your purpose begins to become real. Napoleon Hill's idea of a definite purpose was never simply about wanting more. It was about having a clearly defined objective and directing your thoughts and efforts toward it with persistence. That principle becomes very different when you practice it at 4 a.m. Imagine opening a notebook before sunrise and writing down the one outcome that matters most to you. Not 20 goals. Not a list designed to make you feel productive. One direction. Maybe you want to build a business that gives you greater control over your time. Maybe you want to eliminate financial chaos. Maybe you want to develop the discipline required to pursue an opportunity you've been postponing for years. The point is not to romanticize the goal. The point is to make it visible. Because a vague desire can easily disappear inside a busy day. A defined objective has somewhere to return. And here is the counterintuitive part. Waking up earlier may actually make you more aware of how little time you have been intentionally using. You suddenly see that you don't need another 100 hours. You need fewer scattered hours. One focused hour can reveal what 10 distracted hours were hiding. This is where your mornings begin to become something more than a routine. You read. You write. You think. You plan. You work on something that matters before the demands of the day begin competing for your attention. And slowly, the question changes. Instead of asking, "What do I feel like doing today?" you begin asking, "What deserves to be done?" That is a very different way to live. Because wealth, in the sense Hill discussed it, was never presented as the result of simply wishing for money. It was connected to organized effort, specialized knowledge, decision, persistence, and a definite purpose. Your 4 a.m. hour cannot give you those qualities automatically, but it can become the place where you practice them. And if you keep showing up, something subtle begins to happen. You stop needing every morning to feel inspiring. You begin trusting yourself enough to act even when it doesn't. If this idea speaks to you, write wealth mindset in the comments. Not because typing 2 words can change your financial life, but because making a deliberate statement can mark the moment you stop treating your goal as a vague wish and start treating it as a direction. Let those words remind you of the person you are choosing to become every time you see them. And once your mornings begin to have a purpose, you are ready to discover what those quiet hours can actually do to the way you think. But there is something you need to understand before you turn this into a 4 a.m. ritual. Waking up early is not the transformation. It is the environment in which the transformation can begin. You can wake up at 4 a.m. every morning and still spend that entire hour scrolling through your phone, worrying about money, comparing yourself to other people, or replaying yesterday's problems. You would be awake, but you would not necessarily be moving forward. The real advantage comes from what you repeatedly allow into your mind during those quiet hours. Your attention is limited, and whatever receives it repeatedly becomes easier to return to. That is why your first hour matters so much. If you spend it consuming other people's opinions, your mind begins the day reacting. If you spend it thinking about problems without direction, you can reinforce the feeling that those problems are bigger than you. But if you use that time to read something meaningful, clarify your priorities, develop a valuable skill, write down ideas, or work toward a definite objective, you create a completely different starting point. You are giving your mind an assignment before the world gives it one. And that is where many people misunderstand the idea of reprogramming the brain. You are not going to wake up one morning and magically become a different person. There is no switch. There is no secret frequency. There is no guarantee that 90 mornings will erase every limiting thought you've ever had. Real change is quieter than that. It happens through repetition. A thought appears. You notice it. A familiar impulse tells you to avoid something. You choose differently. A difficult task makes you want to quit. You continue. Over time, those small moments become evidence. And evidence changes the way you see yourself. Imagine someone who has spent years saying, "I'm terrible with money." Every financial setback becomes proof. Every mistake strengthens the story. But then that person begins spending the first hour of every morning learning how money works, reviewing their decisions, developing a skill, and taking one deliberate action toward a financial goal. The circumstances may not change immediately. The bank account may look almost identical for a while. But something important has already started changing. The person is no longer practicing helplessness every morning. They are practicing agency. That distinction can eventually influence decisions, habits, relationships, work, and opportunities. This is also why the number 90 matters differently than you might expect. 90 days should not be treated as a magical deadline after which your brain suddenly becomes wealthy. Think of it as a sustained experiment. Long enough to observe yourself. Long enough to see which excuses keep returning. Long enough to discover whether your routine survives the days when motivation disappears. And long enough to build a relationship with discipline that does not depend on feeling inspired. Because eventually, the question becomes much deeper then. Can you wake up at 4 a.m.? It becomes, what are you repeatedly teaching yourself to believe about who you are? And that question is where the real transformation begins. And now we arrive at the shift I told you about in the beginning. It is not waking up at 4 a.m. It is what you do with your attention once you are awake. For the next 90 days, your goal is not simply to get out of bed before sunrise. Your goal is to stop giving your mind away before you have decided what deserves it. That sounds simple, but try it. Sit in the quiet without reaching for your phone. Notice what your mind immediately wants to do. It may look for stimulation. It may bring up unfinished problems. It may tell you that you should go back to sleep. You don't have to fight those thoughts. You simply have to stop letting every thought become an instruction. That is the shift. You begin creating a space between what your mind produces and what you choose to do. And that space is where self-direction becomes possible. For someone trying to build wealth, this matters enormously. Because financial progress rarely depends on one dramatic decision. It is shaped by thousands of smaller decisions. What you learn, what you ignore, what you spend, what you create, what you postpone, what you tolerate, and what you repeatedly return to. If your attention is constantly fragmented, those decisions become easier to make impulsively. But when you practice directing your attention every morning, you strengthen a different pattern. You become more deliberate. You start noticing opportunities you would have previously overlooked. You begin questioning assumptions that once felt unquestionable. You may recognize that the job you complain about every day is not the only problem. Perhaps you have stopped developing the skill that could give you leverage. You may realize that your financial stress is not solved by earning more alone. Perhaps your habits around spending, planning, and decision-making also need to change. And you may discover something even more uncomfortable. Sometimes the life you say you want requires you to stop protecting the habits that keep your current life comfortable. This is where Hill's philosophy becomes practical. Definite purpose gives your attention a direction. Specialized knowledge gives your effort something useful to build. Persistence keeps you moving when the emotional excitement disappears. And organized planning turns intention into action. Your 4 a.m. routine can become the daily meeting point for all four. You wake up. You become quiet. You remember what you are building. Then you do something that moves it forward. Not someday. Not when you feel ready. That morning. And then the next one. The remarkable part is that the visible results may still take time. Your circumstances may look unchanged while your internal standards are quietly rising. That is why you should not judge the process by what happens in the first few mornings. Judge it by the person who begins to emerge after repeatedly keeping promises that nobody else knew you made. Because once you experience that kind of self-trust, you start carrying it into places where the alarm clock can no longer help you. And that is where these 90 mornings become much bigger than a morning routine. There is another mistake you need to avoid. You might become so focused on waking up at 4 a.m. that you turn the clock into the goal. It isn't. The goal is becoming more intentional with your life. If waking up that early leaves you exhausted, irritable, and unable to function, then the routine is working against the very discipline you're trying to develop. Sleep matters. Recovery matters. A serious commitment to your future should not require you to destroy your ability to function today. So don't worship the hour. Use it. That distinction separates a meaningful practice from a ritual performed for its own sake. Maybe your schedule allows you to wake at 4 a.m. comfortably because you go to bed early. Maybe your responsibilities make that unrealistic. The deeper principle remains the same. Protect a period of uninterrupted time when your mind is capable of thinking before the demands of the day take over. But if you are committed to the 4 a.m. experiment, you need to understand what happens after the initial excitement disappears. The first few mornings can feel powerful. You wake before everyone else. You feel different. You feel ahead. Then life happens. You sleep badly one night. Your workload increases. Someone needs your attention. The weather is miserable. Your motivation disappears. And suddenly that beautiful routine becomes inconvenient. This is where discipline stops being an idea and becomes behavior. Hill wrote extensively about persistence because desire alone does not carry a person through repeated resistance. A definite purpose has to survive the moments when emotion is no longer supporting it. That is why your hardest morning may be more valuable than your easiest one. Not because suffering is inherently productive, because difficulty reveals whether your commitment depends on comfort. Think about someone learning a new skill. When everything is going well, practice feels rewarding. But the real test arrives when progress becomes slow and mistakes become obvious. The same thing happens here. Your first month may not produce dramatic changes. Your second month may expose habits you didn't know were still controlling you. And by the third month, You may realize that the biggest victory was never waking up before sunrise. It was learning that you can remain aligned with a chosen direction even when your emotions change. That lesson reaches far beyond wealth. It changes how you approach your work, how you handle setbacks, how you make decisions, how quickly you abandon difficult goals, and perhaps most importantly, how you speak to yourself when nobody else is listening. There will still be mornings when you don't want to get up. There will still be distractions. There will still be fear. The difference is that those things no longer have automatic authority over your behavior. You notice them, then you decide. And that ability to pause between impulse and action is becoming one of the most valuable forms of personal control you can develop. But there is one final piece missing. Because directing your mornings can change your behavior, yet behavior alone does not determine where you are going. You also need to know exactly what you are directing yourself toward. And once you understand that, your 90 days take on an entirely different meaning. So now you need to make one decision that most people keep postponing. What exactly are you building? Not what sounds impressive. Not what would make someone else proud. What do you actually want your life to look like? Because waking up early without a defined direction can simply give you more time to remain confused. You can spend an hour planning, reading, journaling, and thinking, and still finish the morning exactly where you started. Purpose changes that. When Napoleon Hill wrote about a definite chief aim, he was pointing towards something more demanding than a vague desire for success. You needed a clear objective strong enough to organize your thoughts and actions around it. That principle becomes especially powerful in the early morning. Instead of waking up and asking, "What should I do today?" You already know. You have decided beforehand. Maybe your objective is to build a business. Maybe it is to become financially independent. Maybe you need to acquire a skill that can increase your earning power. Maybe you want to create something that has been sitting in the back of your mind for years. Whatever it is, give it a shape. Put it into words. Then give your mornings a relationship with that objective. This does not mean spending every morning obsessively working toward one goal. It means making sure your attention repeatedly returns to what matters. One morning might be dedicated to learning. Another might be planning. Another might be writing. Another might be solving a problem you have avoided. The activity can change. The direction should remain. And there is a subtle psychological shift that happens when you begin doing this. Your goal stops being something you think about only when you feel inspired. It becomes part of your normal environment. You see it. You work on it. You measure yourself against it. You adjust. You continue. That repeated contact matters because vague ambitions are easy to abandon. A clearly defined objective gives you something concrete against which you can make decisions. Consider a person who says, "I want to make more money." That statement may create excitement for a moment. But what does it tell you to do tomorrow morning? Almost nothing. Now imagine replacing it with something specific. "I will develop a valuable skill, create an additional source of income, and build toward a defined financial target." Suddenly, the morning has somewhere to go. You can research. You can practice. You can create. You can track progress. You can discover what you don't know. The goal has become actionable. And this is where many people make a surprising mistake. They believe clarity comes before action. Often, clarity becomes sharper because of action. You begin working on something and discover what you actually care about. You encounter obstacles and discover what you need to learn. You make mistakes and discover what needs to change. The quiet morning becomes a laboratory for that discovery. And after enough mornings, you may notice something that was difficult to see before. The person who wakes up at 4 a.m. is not necessarily more successful than the person who wakes up at 7. But the person who consistently uses those quiet hours to pursue a definite purpose is training something far more valuable than an early schedule. They are training alignment. And when your daily behavior begins matching the future you say you want, the distance between intention and reality starts to feel different. But there is still a question that your routine alone cannot answer. What happens when the old version of you comes back and asks you to stop? It will. At some point, The old version of you will return. Not dramatically. It may arrive as a thought you barely notice. Just sleep a little longer. You've been doing this long enough. You can work on it tomorrow. And because the thought sounds reasonable, you may believe it. That is what makes old patterns so effective. They rarely announce themselves as sabotage. They often sound like comfort. This is why the 90-day process becomes less about forcing yourself to wake up and more about learning to recognize the moments when you are about to abandon a decision you made while thinking clearly. There is an important difference between listening to yourself and obeying every feeling you have. Your emotions contain information. They do not always contain instructions. You can feel tired and still decide what matters. You can feel uncertain and still take the next step. You can feel afraid and still refuse to let fear make every decision for you. That does not mean ignoring your limits or pretending exhaustion is weakness. It means becoming capable of separating a genuine need for recovery from the familiar impulse to avoid discomfort. And that distinction becomes especially important when you start pursuing financial goals. Building wealth often requires delayed gratification. You may have to learn something before you can earn from it. You may have to save before you can invest. You may have to build credibility before opportunities begin appearing. You may have to work for months before anyone notices what you're creating. The mind naturally prefers immediate rewards. That is why your ability to tolerate a period without visible results can become such an advantage. Imagine planting something and digging it up every morning to check whether the roots have grown. You would never see the growth you were waiting for. Some forms of progress work the same way. You practice, you wait, you adjust, you continue. Then, one day, something becomes visible that had been developing quietly for much longer than you realized. That is how your 90 mornings should be approached. Not as 90 chances to demand immediate evidence that your life is changing. As 90 opportunities to become more deliberate. There will be mornings when the work feels ordinary. There will be mornings when you question whether any of it matters. There may even be weeks when the external results seem almost non-existent. Those periods are not necessarily signs that the process has failed. Sometimes they are the part where your expectations are being separated from your commitment. Hill's philosophy placed persistence alongside definite purpose for a reason. A goal that depends entirely on constant excitement is fragile. You need something deeper. A decision you can return to. A reason that still matters after the emotional high disappears. And eventually, that reason becomes personal. You stop waking up early because you watched a video telling you that successful people do it. You stop doing it because you want to feel productive. You do it because you have decided that your future deserves a portion of your present. That is a much stronger reason. And when you reach that point, the alarm clock is no longer the most important part of the ritual. Something else has taken its place. Your standard for yourself. Your standard changes quietly. You begin to notice that the decisions you make when nobody is watching start affecting the decisions you make when everyone is. You become less willing to waste an entire evening because you know what tomorrow morning requires. You become more protective of your attention because you have experienced what focused time can produce. And slowly, your day begins to organize itself around what matters instead of constantly interrupting what matters. That is one of the less obvious effects of a deliberate morning routine. The change does not stay inside the morning. It follows you. You carry the patience you practiced at 4 a.m. into a difficult conversation. You carry the focus you developed in silence into your work. You carry the ability to delay an impulse into a financial decision. You carry the habit of keeping promises to yourself into moments when quitting would be easier. This is where the idea of reprogramming needs to be understood carefully. You are not erasing your personality. You are not replacing your brain with a new one. You are repeatedly practicing different responses until those responses become more familiar. That can influence the way you approach situations. Instead of immediately thinking, "I can't do this," you may begin asking, "What would make this possible?" Instead of reacting to a setback with, "This always happens to me," you may pause and ask, What can I learn from what just happened? Instead of seeing money as something that only arrives through luck or circumstances outside your control, you may begin looking for skills, problems you can solve, value you can create, and decisions you can improve. That is a profound shift, because wealth begins long before the number in your account changes. It begins with the way you perceive choices. A person can receive more money and still remain financially unstable if their underlying habits never change. Another person can begin with very little and gradually build stronger financial behavior because they learn how to think differently about earning, saving, creating, and investing. The morning routine does not create the wealth. It can create the conditions in which better decisions become more consistent. And consistency compounds. One page read today becomes knowledge later. One skill practiced today becomes competence later. One unnecessary purchase avoided today becomes capital later. 1 hour invested in meaningful work today can become an opportunity you could not have imagined months earlier. None of these actions feels extraordinary by itself. That is precisely why people underestimate them. They are looking for a dramatic turning point. But most meaningful changes are built from ordinary moments repeated long enough to become extraordinary in their consequences. So if you have reached this point, don't ask yourself whether waking up at 4 a.m. will magically change your life. Ask something more useful. What could you repeatedly do during that hour that your future self would be grateful you started today? Because the answer to that question determines whether these 90 mornings become another challenge you eventually abandon, or the beginning of a different relationship with your own potential. And there is one final test that will reveal whether this transformation has truly taken root. The final test is not whether you can wake up at 4 a.m. for 90 days. It is what happens when the 90 days are over. Because anyone can become obsessed with a routine for a short period of time. The harder question is whether the person you became through that routine continues to exist when the challenge no longer feels new. Imagine reaching day 90. The alarm rings. But this time, there is no excitement attached to it. No challenge. No countdown. No promise that something extraordinary is about to happen. Just another morning. And you realize something has changed. You no longer need to convince yourself that getting up matters. You already know what happens when you keep a promise to yourself. That is the deeper reward, not the hour on the clock, the trust you have built. For years, you may have made private promises that nobody else knew about. You would start tomorrow. You would save more. You would learn the skill. You would finish the project. You would stop wasting your time. And every time you broke one of those promises, the world kept moving. Nothing dramatic happened. But somewhere inside you, another piece of evidence was created. You began teaching yourself that your own decisions were negotiable. 90 mornings can begin to reverse that pattern. Not because 90 is a magical number, because repeated follow-through gives you a different kind of evidence. You said you would get up. You got up. You said you would use the time. You used it. You said you would work towards something meaningful. You returned to it when the excitement disappeared. That evidence matters. Self-trust is not something you simply decide to have. It is something you build through behavior. And once you trust yourself more, your relationship with difficulty changes. A setback no longer automatically means stop. A slow month does not automatically mean failure. A rejection does not have to become a verdict on your ability. You begin seeing obstacles as information. Sometimes they tell you to change the strategy. Sometimes they tell you to acquire more knowledge. Sometimes they expose a weakness you need to work on. And sometimes they simply require patience. That is a much more mature relationship with success. You stop expecting every worthwhile pursuit to feel good. You stop interpreting discomfort as proof that you are on the wrong path. You learn to distinguish between a path that is genuinely wrong for you and a path that is simply demanding. That distinction can save you years. Because there will always be a moment when your old habits offer you an easier alternative. Take the shortcut. Spend the money. Skip the work. Delay the decision. Stay comfortable. Nobody will know. But now you know. You know what that choice costs because you've spent enough mornings watching yourself make decisions in silence. And this is where the idea of wealth becomes larger than money. Financial wealth matters. Freedom matters. Security matters. But the ability to direct your own attention, control your responses, develop useful abilities, and remain committed to a meaningful purpose has value long before any financial result appears. That is the foundation. The money is only one possible expression of what you build on top of it. So when you wake up tomorrow, don't ask whether you feel motivated. Ask whether the person you want to become would make the same decision you are about to make. Then listen carefully, because the answer may reveal more about your future than any motivational speech ever could. And after 90 mornings, you may discover that the greatest thing you were building was never the routine itself. You were building a person who no longer needs to be pushed from the outside. A person who can choose. A person who can persist. A person who can walk toward a definite purpose even when nobody is watching. And once that person exists, the final morning is no longer an ending. It is proof that something has already begun. And now, come back to where this began. 4 a.m. The room is dark. The world is quiet. And for a moment, there is nothing demanding your attention. 90 mornings ago, you may have thought the goal was simply to wake up earlier. Now you understand that the hour was never the point. It was the decision. The decision to create space before distraction. The decision to define what matters before the world defines it for you. The decision to keep returning to something meaningful when excitement disappears. You learned that discipline is not about feeling powerful every morning. Sometimes it is simply doing what you decided to do while a quieter part of you says, "Not today." You learn that your thoughts are not commands. You can notice fear without obeying it. You can experience doubt without building your life around it. You can feel tired without automatically surrendering your direction. And you learn that wealth cannot begin with a number alone. It begins with what you repeatedly do with your attention, your time, your abilities, and your decisions. That is why the greatest change may not be visible in your bank account after 90 days. It may be visible in the way you approach an opportunity, in the way you respond to a setback, in the way you spend an hour, in the way you speak to yourself when something doesn't work, in the moment when an old habit reaches for control and you simply choose differently. That moment is small, almost invisible, but your life is made of moments like that. Napoleon Hill's philosophy repeatedly returned to the power of definite purpose, organized effort, persistence, and disciplined thought. The value of those principles is not in repeating them as slogans. It is in living them when nobody is there to applaud. So tomorrow morning, when the room is still dark, you don't need to imagine yourself becoming a completely different person. Just make one deliberate decision, then another. Let the mornings accumulate. Let the effort become familiar. Let your standards rise quietly. And if you miss a morning, don't turn one mistake into an identity. Return the next day. The purpose is not perfection. The purpose is direction. Because 90 days from now, you will have evidence. Evidence of what you practiced. Evidence of what you prioritized. Evidence of which voice you listened to most often. And perhaps the most important realization will be this. You were never waiting for your life to change. You were waiting to see whether you were willing to change what you repeatedly did. So when the alarm rings, before you reach for the phone, pause. Listen to the silence. And remember that somewhere between the person you have been and the person you want to become, there is a quiet decision waiting for you. No applause. No audience. Just you. And what you choose in that moment may become the beginning of everything that comes next. If this video gave you a new perspective, follow the channel and share it with 5 people who are ready to build a stronger mind, a clearer purpose, and a better future.